Latter-day Contemplation is a podcast hosted by two Latter-day Saints who have found great value in experiencing God through walking a path of contemplation. The views expressed herein are our own.
Hello and welcome to Latter-day Contemplation. We are your hosts, Riley Risto
And Christopher Hurtado.
Latter-day Contemplation started as an exploration of contemplative practices from many traditions to enhance our discipleship of Jesus Christ. We are by no means experts in the topics we discuss, but what we have is an openness to questions, a hunger to discover truth wherever we can find it, and a desire to share in the transformative life of inner peace. We love that you've joined us, and we hope that you find value in this community.
Welcome back, everybody. Last time we had Travis Patten on, and we were talking about, at the end, we were talking about the temple drama as the journey of a soul. This week we have Travis back with us to talk about the journey of the soul again. And this time we're going to do it through the lens of Dante Alighieri, the poet, the author of the Divine Comedy. Travis is a lover of Dante and his poetry and has spent a lot of time reading and rereading it. And he and I have taught a class together where we guided people through this poem, mostly Travis. He served as our resident Virgil to guide folks through Dante. And so it's great to have him with us today again to guide us through the poem. And to start us off, Travis, why don't you tell us a little bit about what Dante's poem, The Divine Comedy, means to you, and then maybe give us an overview of it.
Well, the thing that is so distinct about Dante's comedy is the amount of humanity that's in it. I mean, he gives you such a wide swath of life. You see, you meet all sorts of people, you get to know them quickly. These are memorable episodes. And there's so much more to Dante than we think of in the popular conception, right? We think of Dante and we think of hell. We think of Inferno and we think of all these gory, gruesome punishments and so forth. But like Dorothy Sayers says, if you just read Inferno without reading Purgatory and Paradise, it's like going to Paris and just viewing the sewers. They may be really interesting, but they exist so that the rest of the city can't exist. And that's exactly what Inferno is to the rest of the poem. It's there so that the rest can exist. It's kind of like when I was in school, I was in the half of the class that let the top half of the class exist. You have to have the whole picture here, and the Inferno is only part of it. So
that's funny, Travis. Well, why don't we start off then with the poem itself by you giving us an overview of it.
So as I mentioned, we've got Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise. Now, Inferno is the one we're most familiar with. These are sinners who refused to repent in life, and they go to hell, and they're stuck in their punishments. They're stuck in their sins, and the punishments they get are really fitting to the sin. This is called contrapasso in Dante, and that means counter punishment. It's very similar to what we see in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. In fact, you could make a good argument that Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is based on the Divine Comedy. But when you go underground in Charlie's Chocolate Factory, you have all these temptations and so forth, and the kids fall into them, right? So this kid who won't stop eating ends up swelling up or drowns in the chocolate thing, and all these punishments are fitting, and that's how it is in Dante, right? So it's almost in a way that people make their own hell. But if you have repented in the most minimal degree, if you have reached out to God at some point before you die, just turned and looked away from what the sins you were doing are and looked towards God, then you qualify for purgatory. And then you could get into purgatory and you work to purify your soul through what we see as punishments, but they're purgations. They're things to work these sins out of you so that you become like God and can then be in God's presence. And that brings us to paradise, which is Dante reaches the very top of Mount Purgatory, and then he ascends insensibly up into heaven, and he meets the people who are in the presence of God. And it takes the place of a journey through the different spheres. The medieval conception of the cosmos was that the earth was at the center, and then once you get up into the various spheres, the first one's the lunar, and then you have all the planets and so forth. The sun and all the planets, and those are the various spheres, and they all go around the earth, and everything under the earth is the sublunar world, and it's changeable and imperfect. But once you get up there, everything's perfect, and so all of that's heaven. And Dante goes through these different spheres, meeting different people and learning different things along the way, until he finally gets his heart's desire at the very end of paradise.
No spoilers, Travis. Now, maybe we should contextualize the poem a little bit too. You mentioned it's medieval, right?
Yeah, the thing that really got me into the Divine Comedy was, my interest in ascension texts. And so I first looked at Dante as an ascension text, and which it definitely is. And it's fascinating, actually, to see how some of these things, even though it is very much rooted in the medieval world, and in fact is basically an encyclopedia of medieval theology, philosophy, and knowledge of the world. But so much of it is, has similarities even to ascension texts going all the way back to ancient Egypt. The Egyptian journey to the underworld, you have to go and meet these different people along the way to, these different beasts and monsters and things that you have to pass by giving them the right spell or the right sign or password or so forth. And that's exactly how it works with Dante. Virgil takes him along, and they meet these monsters that are frightening, and Virgil quells them by saying the right words and so forth. So, and there's lots of other different interesting things. But so,
Travis, at
yes.
the outset, Christopher asked, what does this mean to you? And I'm someone who's an amateur, someone who's read very little of Dante. I have read the Inferno, and that's it. But I got a sense for, structurally what he was trying to accomplish there. And you just mentioned that, it kind of follows this pattern of descent and ascent texts. And, we see this in the Odyssey, in the Aeneid. You mentioned this Egyptian text. You see it in Norse mythology, of this idea that you've somehow got a balance. There's got to be balance to the cosmos. For all the good of paradise, you've got to have the balance of the evil in Inferno. And it follows this pattern of God's divine justice. So there's, not only is there mercy and justice, but justice itself just implies that when you do something, there's this consequence. And that's kind of, in your explanation to me earlier, that's kind of how Inferno is represented, that these people choose their own hell.
Yeah.
And so going into reading Dante as an amateur, what can someone expect to get out of it? What meaning have you been able to pull out of it for yourself? And what can an amateur going in reading Dante for the first time expect to get out of it?
Riley, it's so difficult to sum up what Dante means to me, or even what Dante is. It is just such a vast, enormous poem that really to read through and think about and kind of get into is really a life-changing experience. It makes you look at yourself. And we see this in the very first line where, it says, midway upon our life's journey. He brings us into it from the very beginning, and does it completely on. So you're just kind of insensibly lulled into the poem, and you start being Dante in a way. You start identifying with him, and he undergoes this transformation. And if you're really working and reading closely in the poem, you can undergo the same transformation. A poem like this is not meant to be just light reading. It's not meant to be, well, I'll qualify that. It is meant to be light reading. He wrote it in Italian when everybody at the time thought he should read it in Latin, but he wanted to reach the average person. But there's depths and depths in this. And as we see Dante transform throughout the poem and become more like God, if we are reading the poem in the right way, in a careful way, and thinking about how these things pertain to our lives, then we get transformed along with him.
So I want to push back on this aspect of it, and I want you to try to walk me through a level of understanding that at this point right now is a little bit beyond me. The way I read Inferno and the transformation that Dante made and the approbation of God upon Dante as he ascends out of hell, and who Dante has become personally is not someone I want to become, at least from my current viewpoint. So this is where I kind of need you to walk me through where you think Dante has been transformed in a positive way. Inferno is a representation of God's justice. And there's a point in the Inferno where Dante tries to show mercy to one of these wretched souls, boiling in stew of mud or whatever, who reaches up to him. And Virgil essentially excoriates him and says, don't touch that wretch. He doesn't deserve mercy. He deserves the justice of his own choosing, of his own actions. And so he starts beating him over the head with an oar. And later on, after doing that, it seems that Dante comes to this understanding of what justice represents. And that there's an understanding of justice that goes beyond the love of God, or at least his conception of what the love of God represented before entering into the Inferno. Is that a positive transformation? And I know that's a subjective question, but maybe you can walk me through a better reconciliation that for me right now is difficult to make.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point that you bring up. I mean, that's really one of really the central things that you have to wrestle with in in the Inferno in particular. We have these episodes where, at the beginning, in the first circle, basically, of hell, where he meets Francesca and she tells him the story of herself and Paolo. And Dante pities these people so much. He's overwhelmed. It's just a beautiful scene as Francesca tells him. Let's look at it here. So this is Canto 5. We have the Antichamber of Hell, and then we have Limbo, where all the righteous and good people who didn't know Christ stay. And those people are not punished. We really see a sympathy for those people in Dante's portrayal, where these people these are the great philosophers, these are the great poets, these are the people he loved himself, that he spent his life studying, and they cannot go into heaven because they lived before Christ or never knew Christ. But they're not being punished. They have a vague longing for God that can never be satisfied, and that's as far as it goes. But then he goes into the next level, which is hell proper, and this is where we have people who give in to lust and so forth. And again, here we have this idea of contrapasso, where the sin fits the punishment. These people were not ruled by their reason and their will. They were buffeted about by their desires, by their emotions, and so forth. And so now in hell, they're being pushed around by these stormy winds and so forth. Anyhow, he sees these two shades floating by and he wants to talk to him. And Francesca, who was killed by her husband when he found her and her brother-in-law together, the husband killed him. And this is how she describes it here. Love, who so fast brings flame to generous hearts, seized him with feeling for the lovely form now torn for me. So love made Paolo do this. Love, who no loved one pardons love's requite, seized me for him so strongly in delight, that as you see he does not leave me yet. Love drew us onwards to consuming death. And now Dante was a love poet before he wrote the comedy, and this is an allusion to his poetry here, these lines. And he has so much pity hearing their story, how love just drew them on and caused them to do this, that he passes out, he faints. And that's Dante's starting point, one of absolute sympathy for the sinners. But there's a really interesting problem with Francesca's portrayal of herself and her situation here. What we see is that she's not taking any personal responsibility for her sin. She blames it on love. Love made me do it. Love did this. I couldn't help myself. And that's why she's here in hell, because she never recognized this as a sin that she had committed. There was always justification. And that's one thing we learn from Dante, is if you continually justify yourself in sin, then you are damned. You can make no progress at all.
I understand that aspect, and I appreciate that explanation. How does the physical act of someone, boiling in their sins, metaphorically in the mud, reaching up for salvation, not represent that same either repentance or change of heart? It's almost as if the suffering wretch needs to continue to suffer to some extent before his sin can be forgiven. It's like a personal atonement rather than a Christian atonement.
Well, yeah, Dante's working within the framework of Catholic belief, where there is a very clear hell and there's a very clear heaven, and the divide between them is separate. In Mormon theology, we really don't have a hell, a hell proper, right? I mean, the telestial, terrestrial, and celestial kingdoms are just all three different divisions of heaven. So everybody makes some level of heaven eventually, unless you're a son of perdition, all that sort of thing. But for Dante, what he's really pointing out here is that things have consequences. One thing that always kind of bugs me is this, maybe just because I'm a pessimist, and I probably go too far the other way, but this idea that everything's just going to work out in the end. Don't worry, it's in God's hands and everything's just going to work out in the end. Dante does not believe that at all. Not on a personal level. If you don't take responsibility for your sins, and if you don't make the move towards God, at some point, you are damned. And that's the theme over and over and over through Inferno. They all justify themselves. They all are stuck in that same mentality. When we get to Purgatory, we'll see how the people in there are no worse sinners than the ones in hell. Some of them are worse than anyone we find in hell, really. And but at some point in their life, at some point before they died, they recognized that they were sinners, and they called out to God. They looked towards Christ. They repented. They stopped looking in the direction of their sins, and they looked towards Christ, and they're saved. So if they make it into purgatory, they're saved because they reached out to God. If you are stuck in your sins and refuse to do anything about it, if you refuse to reach out to God, if you just stay there and refuse to even call out on Christ the littlest bit, then you are damned. There's nothing God can do with you. There's nothing anyone can do with you. And Dante, by the time he goes through the end of hell, he stops feeling this pity. He starts recognizing this for what it is. I mean, it's kind of like, you see parents who always believe their children, right? Who always take their children's point of view against anybody else, even if it's their teachers, if it's whatever. They're always justifying their children, and their children just manipulate them and let them get away with whatever they want, right? And that's how Dante is at the beginning. And by the end of it, he finally is able to call BS on it. He says, no, you sinned. You are a wretch. You refuse to take any responsibility. And you're here because you've chosen to be here. And that's all there is to it.
So I see two things going on here. There's one is the justice and judgment of God, which in this context is absolute. There's no questioning it. even to the point where murder is in a higher circle of hell than fraud or whatever. Like the order of them is a little strange, but we're not to question that because that's God's justice, at least how it's framed here. However, there's this biblical phrase where Jesus is answering his disciples, and the disciples ask him, Master, how often shall we forgive someone who has wronged us? And he says 70 times 7. He says, unto you it is given to forgive all. And essentially let God be the judge, right? And I see this interesting way in which God's justice, albeit absolute, has been moved into the consciousness of Virgil and Dante, and they've said essentially, we're going to take on this role of judge, and far be it from us to have pity, mercy, or compassion upon this person, despite the fact that in the Bible that's specifically, it seems to me, to be commanded. And so I think there's one viewpoint wherein it's clear that we're not to question God's judgment, and there's an understanding that comes from that. But then there's also this kind of strange, and maybe it's just an adoption of the current day's religious understanding, the harsh kind of understanding they had of an impersonal God that had developed since the proto-Christianity, wherein, we're supposed to act as if we are gods, in a sense, rather than being that merciful, compassionate, forgiving disciple. We are to be an instrument in God's hand to exact judgment as he would.
I wonder if we can look at this in another way, and maybe this will be helpful. Travis, can we say, on the one hand, when we look at Riley saying that someone's boiling in the mud or whatever, paying for his sins, he says that he reaches out for mercy and he doesn't receive it. You've already pointed out, Travis, that in a sense the time for that has passed. I wonder, though, is he really repenting? Is that really what's going on here? And if we can, maybe for Dante, there's this cutoff and there's this more definite place, as you've said, but we can still see this in a way where if we are in our own hell that we create for ourselves because we don't repent, and it's possible that this very character that we're talking about is not actually repenting, right? That he's in some sense wanting out of the punishment, but not recognizing that there's a sin, the way that you said Paola didn't actually recognize her own responsibility. And just, of course she wants out. Why am I here? I couldn't help myself, right? So she wants out. But the only way out is to recognize that you put yourself in there when you don't recognize your sin, right? Your responsibility in some sense. So, and then the other thing is, another aspect I wonder, Travis, isn't what we see happening to Dante isn't really about, I don't see him as making neither Dante nor Virgil as being judges, or whether as vicegerents of God or in any other sense. I think what I see here is that Dante he's actually undergoing, it's about Dante is what I'm trying to say. It's not about the guy in the mud. It's about Dante. It's about what's happening to him. The guy in the mud, on the one hand, I'm suggesting at least, isn't repentant. And Dante is learning something's happening to him, right? To Dante himself.
That's actually the exact point I'm trying to get to, actually. Because when Jesus says forgive 70 times 7, it's implied that the person who they're forgiving isn't truly repentant because they keep repeating the same offense over and over and over. And yet Jesus says, forgive, 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 and leave it to God to be the judge. Whereas I think that Dante, and this is encouraged by Virgil, is taught to develop this sense of strictness and sternness that's the opposite of pity. Like, don't pity that person. How dare you pity that person? That would be to question God's justice.
But is it about that person?
No, it's about Dante. And
it's about Dante, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to leave Travis out of this conversation, but I think we're talking past each other a little bit. So go ahead, Travis.
So, yes, there's a couple of things going on here. what we see in Dante is him learning to see things the way God sees them. These are people who, we read in the scriptures of people who are, have these plagues and these things come upon them, and instead of turning to repent, they curse God and die. That's the mentality that Dante's coming across here. And so these people are not repentant. They've gone into this eternal damnation with the same spirit that they left this world with. And so as Dante, he starts to see that what they've done to themselves, what they're doing. Now, this is completely different from, when he gets up into heaven and he talks to Kunitsa, who was an adulteress and had many husbands and many lovers and so forth. But she's in paradise, and she can talk about her sin without any sort of justification, and she can talk about the sin in general with a proper recognition of its place. There's, she's not defending it. She's not antagonistic towards anything. She is sympathetic towards the weakness in people. But only...
And this is the same sin. She's committed the same sin as Paola.
Yeah. And yet she's in heaven and Francesca's in hell. And the difference is, the difference is that in heaven they've recognized that they are sinners. That's all you have to do. So Dante is not pronouncing judgment. He's not even judging anybody. He's just slowly starting to understand how God sees these people. And God sees these people as, how many times have I tried to gather you and you would not? And so there's nothing I can do. You've brought this upon yourselves. You've taken yourselves out of my power. You have your free will. I can do nothing. You have made yourself a hell. I made the place for you to go, and you've sent yourself there. And I couldn't stop it. I couldn't do anything. Because you refused to just reach out your hand in the littlest degree. And that's all you had to do. And you just refused to do it.
That reminds me of the geography of the comedy. I wonder if it's probably good to mention the idea of why there is a hell in the first place.
Yeah, and this is interesting too. So let's go to Canto 3 here. These are some of the most famous lines of the whole Divine Comedy. And I'm going to read them in Italian. I know most people aren't going to understand Italian, but you get the feel for how this is, I think, much more stronger in the Italian. Then we'll give you the translation. Per me si va nella città dolente, per me si va nell'eterno dolore, per me si va tra la perduta gente, giustizia mosse al mio alto fattore, fecemi la divina podestate, la somma sapienza, e il primo amore. And then, so that's, through me you go to the grief-racked city, through me you go to everlasting pain, through me you go and pass among lost souls. And then this is the interesting part. Justice inspired my exalted creator. I am a creature of the holiest power, of wisdom in the highest, and of primal love. So these are the words painted across, carved across the gate of hell. And it's basically hell speaking here, right? I mean, I'm a creature of the holiest power, of wisdom in the highest, and of primal love. And that's the kicker at the very end. Hell was created out of love. Because if you don't have consequences, then you cannot be free. You cannot choose to do what's right. I mean, we know this very clearly. I mean, we know, that Satan's plan was, typically we look at this like he was going to take away our free will and save everybody. But God just refuses to do that.
Another way of looking at that is that he was going to take away the consequence. It's not the majority view, but it is a minority view, right? Another sense of taking away agency is instead of taking away choice, is to take away accountability.
Yep.
Which really is trying to, how do you say, tapar el dedo con el sol con el dedo?
Yep. So I think So I don't know. I
How
mean,
do you?
that's yeah, trying to block out the soul with your thing, with your hand, right? You just it really is.
It can't be done, right?
Yeah, you it's like a little kid who thinks they can hide by covering their face. I mean, you've got to grow up and realize, no, there are constraints here, and I have to confront them, and I have to be responsible. I have to make things happen in my life. And Dante finds that out, but he needs the help of Virgil to do that. And I think that's significant too. That a lot of times we need somebody to pick us up and pull us along.
So, Travis, while this might be explicitly like a very religious tale, many of the things contained within it, they're not found in the Bible specifically. But there's a psychological element to why this has connected to people over the centuries. And it maybe it has to do with structure, maybe it has to do with the way the message is communicated, maybe it has to do with the beautiful poetry. But what can you speak about in terms of the psychological message that's being communicated here? I mean, I see a very basic, kind of like a dual nature structure to this, where there was the one quote I read to you before we started recording by Carl Jung that says, "No tree can reach heaven unless its roots descend down to hell." And it's almost like there's a psychological element to this that connects with people on a deeper level.
Yeah, there really is. I mean, this is the experience of an everyman, right? I mean, Dante is not some superhero going through and just with powers that nobody else has. I mean, when Virgil says we've got to go down and take this other path, you can't just go straight up the mountain past those three beasts that are terrifying you. You've got to go another way, and you've got to descend into hell before you can make it out the other side. And Dante says, "But who am I? I'm not Aeneas, who descended in the Aeneid. I'm not Paul. I'm not any of these people. I'm just a regular guy." And that's how it is for us. And so not only do you have in the comedy just an interesting story with lots of interesting characters and memorable scenes and so forth, but you have something that resonates. I mean, there's this three-part division. I mean, we are cast out. Well, let's yeah, boy, there's so much good stuff here. Where do we want to go from here? So you have this sort of enactment of a soul's journey of what everybody really has to go through in some way if they're going to get that true understanding of their own soul. You have to search and you have to rack and you have to be willing to face things that you don't want to, and go through whatever has to be gone through in order to get out on the other side.
You bring up a really interesting point, because there's the sense in which you have to experience some of these things in order to really know them, but there's also the sense of being able to witness the experiences of other people and learn from it. And maybe that's one of the reasons why it connects with people as well, is because, not only is it a description of a soul's journey, many souls' journey, but it's also the ability to learn from the mistakes of others and be transformed without having necessarily to experience all of the consequences of these evil acts that are described.
That's a really good point. Travis, another thing I wanted to ask you this, it sounds like when you say that there's something that you can learn from this, it sounds like you're not saying that this is what Dante is thinking, but that you yourself are saying this. And so despite my own theology, whether I believe in a hell like Dante's or that there's even a purgatory, there's something here for me, right?
Yeah, and whenever I've taught Dante, I always focus on two things. Let's try and understand what he's saying here. What's the text saying? But really, the most important thing is, what does it mean to you? The meaning you get out of this doesn't have to be the meaning that Dante is trying to convey. I mean, that's that's kind of the center of mysticism in general, is this creative journey to God, that you build meaning out of these things that help you focus, that help you shape your life, that help you give yourself a trajectory. And these things, you don't have to go with what the original symbols symbolized if they ever did have a true pure meaning or anything like that. So Dante takes you along and he points things out and lets you reflect on it. Right? I mean,
And part of what makes the possibility of the interpretation of the poem open is the poetry, right? Is that it is poetry.
yeah, and that's what's so hard about Dante because it's the the Italian is so beautiful. I mean, he is just an unbelievable poet. And
Perhaps the greatest.
yeah, I mean, Eliot famously said, Shakespeare and Dante divide the world between them. There is no third.
Mm.
I mean, it's just incredible poetry, and there's no translation that conveys it, unfortunately. But you can still get, this feeling, this impact, the experience that he's trying to convey, even in translation. And that's one of the wonderful things about literature, right? Is you can learn vicariously. I mean, they've shown that, people who read novels and so forth are more empathetic. They've been able to see into people's hearts and souls more often, even if it's just made up people. But you learn to put yourself in other positions. You learn to analyze what you are doing yourself and be able to see things from different points of view. And that makes you a more humane person. And Dante is preeminent in this.
Travis, before we go on the soul's journey, and just so we don't forget later, perhaps we should recommend a translation for those interested in reading.
Well, that's your province, Christopher. You're the one who's at least looked at virtually every translation out there. In the class we've done, we use Robin Kirkpatrick's Penguin Classics, and
Yeah.
part of that is because it's a good translation. Part of it is because I love all the essays that he gives you after every canto and so forth. But I think Musa's translation is very good. Um, who else do you think?
Mark Musa.
Who do you like? Yeah, Mark Musa.
I'm surprised you didn't mention Dorothy Sayers.
Yeah, I do like Dorothy Sayers quite a bit. And
I like Robert Pinsky's translation of the Inferno and Merwin's translation of the Purgatory, but then I can't recommend a standalone translation for Paradiso, and that's where I fall back on Kirkpatrick again. And I recommend going with the separate volumes of each of the cantos because you get more notes. If you want the notes. If you don't want all the notes, then there's a one volume. It's easier to find. It's cheaper.
so yeah, I mean, Dante is one of these ones that having some notes makes it very easy. But I don't want people to go out and spend too much time looking up references. You should just pick it up and read it as a story. I think don't let don't get caught up in the commentaries. Sinclair's old version is actually prose, but it's one of the best. It's a good translation and just enough notes to keep you oriented.
Well, that brings us back to that journey, right? It is a story, and it's the story of us. It's the story of every human soul's journey, and that's what we really want to bring out of it.
Yeah, so let's look at a few of these representative encounters that Dante has in Inferno first here. One of the most famous and one of the most beautiful in general is in Canto 5, where we have Francesca and Paolo, who are they're in the first true circle of hell, and this is where people are punished for their carnal lusts and so forth. These are people who are ruled by their passions, and they're buffeted about by their passions. So when they go to hell, now they're now buffeted about by these winds that blow them all over the place. So this is the first circle of hell, and the way hell is organized is you start with the kind of carnal animal sort of things that are common to just animal nature, and then you go all the way down to the deepest pit of hell is that of fraud, when you use your mind, your God-given intellect, and twist that supreme gift and use it for evil. So that kind of gives you the trajectory of of his descent into hell. So this is the first circle. Francesca and Paolo, they were both murdered. Francesca's husband found them together and killed them both. They were in flagrante delicto. So this is how Francesca tells her story. She says, "Love, who so fast brings flame to generous hearts, seized him with feeling for the lovely form now torn from me." So Paolo was just seized by love and saw her form and just couldn't help himself. "Love, who no loved one pardons love's requite, seized me for him so strongly in delight, that as you see, he does not leave me yet," even in death there. "Love drew us onwards to consuming death." And it's so. And then Dante says, "Well, how does this happen?" And she says, "Well, one day we read together for pure joy how Lancelot was taken in love's palm. We were alone, we knew no suspicion. Time after time the words we read would lift our eyes and drain all color from our faces. A single point, however, vanquished us. For when at last we read the longed-for smile of Guinevere, at last her lover kissed, he, who from me will now never depart, touched his kiss trembling to my open mouth. This book was a Galahalt, a pander, the pimp. That day we read no further down those lines. And all the while as one of them spoke on, the other wept. And I, in such great pity, fainted away, as though I were to die. And now I fell as bodies fall, for dead." So Dante is absolutely sympathetic to their plight. He pities them so deeply that at the very end, he falls, he faints, and passes out. And this is where we see first Dante identifying with the sinners. Okay, he's caught up in her story. But what's interesting about her story is how she blames everything on love. "It's love that made me do this. It wasn't my choice. Love doesn't pardon you. Love makes you do these things." And then she says, "We were reading about Guinevere and Lancelot, and that book made us fall into sin." And that's so significant for Dante's view of how hell actually is and how the mentality of the people in hell is.
How so, Travis?
These are people who are in hell because they refused to take any responsibility. They refused to have any self-awareness. They refused to do any introspection, any looking into their own life. So they never repented. They never reached out to God. They never admitted they sinned. And that's why they're there. If we go on again, skipping forward quite a bit to Canto 26. Let me see. Do you guys want to comment on that part before I go on?
Yeah. So we can see here a first step is a contemplative step of noticing, right? Of introspection, of actually noticing where we are actually responsible, right?
Yeah, I mean that is the starting place. Is contemplation, is observation, is looking. And you have to be able to look into your own soul. If there are things that you are hiding from yourself, if you're lying to yourself, if you're putting up these walls defending things you've done, then you can't do it. You cannot have a true contemplative experience. The only way you get to know yourself is by looking inside, by admitting where you were wrong and being able to face those things. And that's what Dante learns, and that's what he tries to help us learn too as we go along this journey with him.
And there's no real progress possible until then. Right? That's what it takes to be able to move forward, is to recognize where we are. It all starts with where we are.
Yeah.
Is there a point at which Dante adopts this attitude of introspection and awareness about his own actions as a result of seeing these examples before him of people who were not introspective or took any accountability?
Yeah, we see this. We see this with Piero della Vigna, who was a suicide, and he killed himself out of this pride. And Dante also recognizes the sin of pride in himself. That's kind of where we first start to see Dante really saying, "Okay, I've got some of these issues myself." And that's kind of a turning point for him. And he goes along, and again and as he talks to people, this is kind of borne in on him until at the very end, in Canto 33, he hears this story of Ugolino, who is a, it's such a tragic story. This man was locked up in a tower with his children, and they just were locked up and starved to death. And he tells his story that he trusted in Ruggieri, the archbishop, and well, let me tell you how he finds him here, where Dante meets Ugolino and Ruggieri. So Count Ugolino and the Archbishop Ruggieri. And if we go to Canto 32, Dante says, "By now we had already gone our way, but then I saw two frozen in a single hole, one head a headpiece to the one below. As bread is mangled by some famished mouth, so too the higher gnawed the lower head, precisely where the nape and brain stem meet."
Wow, that's really, really graphic.
And it's worse as we get into Canto 33. Jaws lifted now from that horrible dish, the sinner wiping clean each lip on hair that fringed the mess he'd left the head in at its rear. I mean, it's just absolutely horrifying.
Why read this, Travis?
This is one of the most interesting and complex parts of the Divine Comedy. We have this horrible, horrible image, this that turns your stomach. And then he goes on, Ugolino, who is chewing on Count Ruggieri's head, tells us his story. And he talks about how he was betrayed, locked up in the tower. He says, because of me, they call it now the Hunger Tower. And he's there with his children. And he says, I woke before the day ahead had come, and heard my sons, my little ones were there, cry in their sleep and call out for some food. How hard you are if, thinking what my heart foretold, you do not feel the pain of it. Whatever will you weep for, if not that? But now they all had woken up. The time was due, when as routine our food was brought. Yet each was doubtful, thinking of their dream. Listening, I heard the door below locked shut. He says, I did not weep. Inward, I turned to stone. They wept. And then my boy Anselmo spoke, What are you staring at, father? What's wrong? And so I held my tears in check and gave no answer all that day, nor all the night that followed on until another sun came up. A little light had forced a ray into our prison so full of pain I now could see on all four faces my own expression. Out of sheer grief I gnawed on both my hands, and they who thought I did so from an urge to eat, all on the instant rose and said, Father, for us the pain would be far less if you would choose to eat us. You having dressed us in this wretched flesh ought now to strip it off. So I kept still to not increase their miseries, and that day and the day beyond we all were mute. Hard, cruel earth, why did you not gape wide? As then we reached the fourth of all those days, Gatto pitched forward, stretching at my feet. Help me, he said. Why don't you help me, Dad? And there he died. You see me here, so I saw them, the three remaining, falling one by one between the next days 5 and 6. Then let myself, now blind, feel over them, calling on each. Now all were dead for 2 days more. Then hunger proved a greater power than grief. And that's where Dante gives us to understand that then he cannibalized his children. And then he goes back, his words were done, now eyes askew, he grabbed once more that miserable skull, his teeth like any dog's teeth strong against the bone. And that's where it's just so hard to go on after that episode, where it's so pitiable. Ugolino up in this tower, he just tells you the story that just moves you, and you just are horrified, and then pitying and weeping for them, and then horrified again.
Well, now we're back to Riley's question. Should we not pity him?
Well, let's.
I mean, I'm not saying I would eat my children, but
But it's pitiable.
He seems like he was between a rock and a hard place, and it's pitiable that he did.
Yep. So Dante ends this by saying they moved on, they saw other people there. They're in this storm, as they go farther and farther into hell, it gets more frozen and frozen and frozen. And the
Frozen.
the symbolism is there that things start freezing up and become more and more immobile. And he sees these people that they weep, yet weeping does not let them weep. Their anguish meets a blockage at the eye. Turned in, this only makes to their heartache more. Their tears first cluster into frozen buds, and then as though a crystal visor fill the socket of the eye beneath each brow. So these people are crying, the tears are freezing in their eyes, and they can't cry, so it makes them just want to cry more because they can't get it out. But Dante says, my own face now, a callus in the chill, had ceased to be a throne to any kind of sentiment. So that's how he's transformed. And this really, I think, Riley, brings up your point from before, that how, that we are moved so much by reading this, and yet Dante remains immovable. And it goes back again and Dante makes this, his artistry here is just amazing, that in just a few lines he can, make us, make our feelings run this gamut. But Dante is immovable. He realizes that God's justice is just, and that these people. Oh gosh, where do we go? This is too difficult.
It's exhausting. Like it almost, it's hard for me to listen to, just like it's hard for you to read. It reminds me of when I was in Florence and you go to Il Duomo di Santa Maria Fiore and you climb those steps and you look at that internal ceiling fresco, and what do you see? It's this Giorgio Vasari's depiction of hell, essentially, or the judgment, right? Have you seen that, Travis?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in person, it's shocking because you get an up close and personal vision of these life-size, pictures, illustrations of people just suffering almost exactly the way that you just described. It's perverse, it's disgusting, it's beyond the pale. And well, I was just going to say it's interesting to me if you look at the time period there of when that was finished, like, 15th, 14th centuries. I mean, it's within a couple hundred years here of Dante, and you look at perhaps, anyway, the impact or the influence that he had upon, Christianity writ large within Europe, but also definitely art.
I've seen in the baptistry across from the cathedral, the same cathedral, there are also paintings on the ceiling that I've seen at least one of these translations. I think it's Kirkpatrick's, or maybe it was Musa's, but no, I think it's Kirkpatrick's that a scene appears from that painting on the cover of the Inferno.
So yeah, and that's appropriate.
We've got to get to Purgatory. You've got to get us out of this hell.
Take us out of here, Travis.
So, Canto 1 of Purgatory, and I'm going to read a little bit because you'll see. I just want to give you a feel for how different Purgatory is now. So these are the first lines. To race now over better waves, my ship of mind, alive again, hoists sail and leaves behind its little keel the gulf that proved so cruel. So we didn't read Canto 34. We read some of Canto 33. But in Canto 34, Dante actually sees the devil, and he's frozen. He's enormous and frozen in the center of the earth. And Dante climbs up his body till he gets to the midway point, and then it's like, he has to turn the other way and climb backwards, because that's now kind of symbolizing that everything's different. Everything's changed now. In hell, he always walks to the left. He goes down the circles walking left. From now on, he's going to walk to the right. He's going to walk on the right way. And so Canto 1 of Purgatory leads us, we're out of hell, and this is how it starts. To race now over better waves, my ship of mind, alive again, hoists sail, and leaves behind its little keel the gulf that proved so cruel. And I'll sing now about that second realm where human spirits purge themselves from stain, becoming worthy to ascend to heaven. Here too dead poetry will rise again, for now, you sacred muses, I am yours. So let Calliope a little play her part, and follow as I sing with chords that scourge the wretched magpies, young girls once, till they despaired of pardon for their insolence. Soft hues of sapphire from the orient, collecting gently, marked the circles now of skies serene from height to horizon. And this sight, once I left the morbid air which weighed so heavy on my eyes and heart, began afresh to bring my eyes delight. The lovely planet strengthening to our love lit up with laughter all the orient sky, veiling her escort Pisces in bright light. I turned now to the right, I set my mind upon the southern pole, and saw 4 stars that none save Eve and Adam ever saw. The heavens, it seemed, rejoiced in these 4 gleams. So it's just extreme extreme difference here once we get into purgatory, and you just find yourself lifted up.
Now, Travis, we talked about translations. I don't remember whether we said which one you're reading from. It is Kirkpatrick, right?
Yeah, this is Kirkpatrick.
Yeah.
So can you guys feel the difference? You know, I hope it comes across, the difference, the stark difference that we get just in the first canto of Purgatory.
Yeah, it's absolutely palpable. You can just feel it more than even hearing it.
There's such power in this poetry, even in translation.
Yeah. If we had time, I would just like to read some of the Italian because it's just so beautiful. And the first 9 cantos, canti in particular, of Purgatory are just beautiful. As Dante, makes it to the shore of Purgatory. Purgatory is a mountain that was forced out on the other side of the earth, arose out of the ocean, and when the devil fell from heaven, the devil fell so hard he made hell as he went through, and ended up in the middle of the earth and pushed out earth on the other side, and that's Mount Purgatory. So now Dante...
That sounds cartoonish.
Yeah.
Doesn't it? Like Wile E. Coyote?
Yeah, I can see that. It's vivid, right?
Yeah.
So here in Canto 2 again. So lovely Aurora's cheeks, both red and white, were turning where I was to sallow rose as dawn grew older in the eastern sky. I mean, this is just the sort of poetry we get here. It's not until...
Even your parrot is delighted by it.
Yeah. So up until Canto 9, they're kind of going through, meeting some people in kind of the antechamber of Purgatory. Is my door closed? Okay, here we go. That's there's actually not a parrot here in the house. This is just evoked by Dante's poetry here. You're now finding yourself in some sort of a tropical paradise with birds singing to you and so forth.
It's like when you hear choirs of angels, right?
Yeah, choirs of a single strident parrot. Okay, so we'll skip forward into Canto 9 of Purgatory. And this is where Purgatory proper really begins. They're starting to, line 67 of Canto 9. And since my leader saw that I had now no cares, he moved to climb, with me behind him still, the wall towards the heights. So they start climbing up here. So up until Canto 9, they're just kind of in the antechamber of Purgatory. Canto 9, we really get to the mountain of Purgatory, where they begin to climb. And the first thing they see as they begin to climb is a gate with an angel by it, and he's got a sword in his hand, and he starts to question them. And
who are they, Travis?
Oh, sorry, this is Dante and Virgil again. So
we still have Virgil with us.
Yeah, so Virgil's still his guide, and he'll be his guide all through Purgatory until they reach the earthly paradise, which is at the very top of the mountain. And from then, Virgil has to leave him.
And why is that?
Well, we'll get there. We'll get there.
Okay.
Basically, we'll get there. So they come, and he says, "Come forward." The courteous guardian began, this angel says, "Come forward, therefore, to these stairs of ours." And there we came to them. The first great block was marble, white, so burnished and so clean, that I, as I appear, was mirrored there. The second, in its tint more dark than purse, was rock, waste, rough to touch, and scorched and dry, cracked both across and upward to its height. The third, which massively weighed these two down, was porphyry, it seemed, and flamed as bright as fresh blood spurting from a severed vein. And on this third the angel of the Lord had placed both feet, and sat across the threshold, which as it seemed was adamantine stone. Now these three steps represent salvation. They represent the plan of salvation. You have the first step that's white. It's pure. This is the innocence of the garden. This is where our parents freely communed with God. And then the second one is rock, waste, rough to touch and scorched to dry. This is when they're cast out into the dark and dreary wilderness. And then the third step, which is bright as a fresh blood spurting from a severed vein. This is the atonement here. So we're now grounded in the plan of salvation, the three pillars of eternity, and the angel is going to, Dante falls at his holy feet and asks that he for mercy open the gate. But first 3 times I beat upon my breast. The angel, then sketched 7 P's across my brow, the letter P, written with sword point. When you're once within, make sure, he said, you go and wash these scars. So Dante has the letter P, which stands for peccatum in Latin. It's sin. He has these 3 P's inscribed across his forehead. These 7 P's. And he has to clean these off as he goes through. And that's what purgatory is all about. Here are people who are being purged. And a lot of the punishments, they're not as graphic and they're not as gory as we saw in hell, but they're still representative of the sins that people had. So, people are pushing boulders around. They're doing all sorts of things that are just meant to cleanse their soul. These are, in a way, spiritual exercises, and the people are happy to do them. They're excited because they know that this is preparing them for heaven. And that's the huge contrast between the people in purgatory and the people in hell.
In other words, the people in purgatory know they belong there because they know they're sinners and they're happy to be doing whatever it takes to purge themselves of their sins, whereas the people in hell are in denial. And we could say that's what it means to be in hell, is to be in denial of our sins. It's interesting because it seems to me that while sin itself can cause pain, it's not that most of the pain comes from the denial and therefore and the subsequent lack of repentance.
Yeah, it's kind of like these people are exercising, right? When you exercise, you suffer, right? I mean, that's just how it works. You hurt and you exercise, you're out of breath, but you do it because you know it's making you a better person. You're not just sitting there taking no responsibility for your life, like the people in hell do. So he goes through these 7 levels that all have to do with the 7. Wait
a minute. All of a sudden, I feel like a sinner for not exercising.
Well, I'm glad. I was directing that comment at you particularly.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. So everything in purgatory is based on love that is wrong. And so you have to purge your love and get it straightened out. The desire for things has to be corrected to be in the right way. Lust has to be turned to proper love. Gluttony has to be turned, from just a love of eating to being able to control your appetites and so forth. So it's this idea that if you don't control your desires, then they will control you. Who said that, Christopher? I think you've told me that one before.
It's my own expression of what Aristotle is teaching in the Nicomachean Ethics. I always say because the Nicomachean Ethics is about happiness. And if you don't control your desires, then your desires control you. And if your desires control you, then you're never satisfied. And if you're never satisfied, well, then how can you be happy? That's why temperance or moderation is a virtue.
Yeah.
Because it leads to happiness.
And that's actually exactly what Piccardo de Donati says in Paradise. So let's try and get there here quickly. So we get to the top of Purgatory, and this is the earthly paradise, and Dante sees Beatrice for the first time. Beatrice is the one who sent Virgil to save Dante when he was in the dark wood. And Beatrice, of course, was Dante's love that he met first when he was 9 years old, and loved her forever. And then kind of, as she says, she rebukes him for stopping loving him once she had died. And so they come, and here's a real. Let's see here. So Dante has gone through the 7 levels of purgatory. He's had every one of these sins washed off his face, and he has learned, and his soul has been shaped until at the end, Virgil tells him, he says, "No longer look to me for signs or word. Your will is healthy, upright, free and whole, and not to heed that sense would be a fault. Lord of yourself, I crown and mitre you." So Dante now has his will aligned with the Lord's will. So whatever he wills will now be the right thing. So he doesn't need Virgil to guide him. And at this point, he sees Beatrice. And Beatrice, from now on until the very end, will be his guide. So what happens in the very beginning of Paradise is...
Before we move on to Paradise, so Dante has now aligned his will with God. He's gone through Purgatory. He's purged himself of his sins. He's paid some kind of price, but mostly he's learned something. I know we're not really covering, obviously we're not reading the poem, but can you give us a little more sense of how he does this and how I might do it?
The biggest change is Dante realizing that he has these sins and that he has to work on these. He recognized clearly that he has pride. And as he comes across the terrace where pride is cured, he says, I look at this and I can feel the weights on my shoulders already. I mean, he knows that if he doesn't fix this, he will feel these chains, these weights that the proud are now carrying, that are bowing them down when before they held their heads so high. And this is similar to I think of a Christmas Carol, where Scrooge is warned, if you do not change your ways, you'll have heavier chains than I do. And it's an introspection. It's realizing, it's looking at yourself and saying, okay, this is what I do. And what Dante is so good at is showing you these sins and giving you a chance to look at yourself and say, Lord, is it me?
So that's the real value then in reading even Inferno, right? And Purgatory is going through this, and we've had a taste through some of the passages you've shared of how moving they can be, whether they're repulsive or whether they are, in some sense, how should I say, uplifting. Whether they bring us down or lift us up, they work on our soul. And seeing those sins in others, as you mentioned earlier, we can become more empathetic, right? By knowing the inner lives of others through fiction, and this is fiction, through literature. And so that's the value then in taking this journey with Dante through the comedy.
Yeah, and you've struck a chord with me as well on that note in terms of the value of introspection as this contemplative journey unfolds, and being able to ask yourself that question, which is not strictly a religious question, It's very much a spiritual question, but it's also a psychological question. Is it I? Lord, is it I? And that's really the question that pulls the most truth out of you and causes you to stare it in the face. And if there's a grander narrative that I see unfolding as you go through these levels, it's exactly that. It's coming face to face with your shadow and being able to reconcile yourself to a higher standard.
There's an unfolding of justice, right? Of everything being put in its proper place, of coming into alignment with the will of God, of seeing things how they really are, of what we mean, which is what we mean by repentance. It's powerful.
Yeah, it really is. And once you achieve that spot where you're no longer lying to yourself, where you're no longer trying to hide things from yourself, where you're able to face everything, then you can actually make true progress. And Dante finds that it just comes naturally. Once he's on the top of Mount Purgatory, he sees Beatrice. Beatrice is looking at the sun, and Dante tries to look at the sun. He can't do it for very long, even though he says he could look at it there longer than he can on Earth. And so he begins to look at Beatrice, who becomes a second sun, and the light begins to pour into him, and it transforms him so much that he just begins to ascend into heaven, without even really noticing it, without even really realizing that he's changed. His soul is so light that he just is drawn to heaven, and he's full of light. And the light, as Dante says, cleaves unto him and draws him back. And this again is a Neoplatonic thing that we've talked about before, where the light just pours over and draws you back up to the source. And he begins to meet people in heaven, and he learns about how heaven is ruled. And one of the really significant passages is in Paradise 3, where he's talking to Picarda de Donate, and she says, he writes that, along with the other shades she smiled, then answered me with so much gladness, she seemed alight with love's first fire. Brother, the power of love subdues our will, so that we long for only what we have, and thirst for nothing else. And so everybody is in heaven in place. They're loving what they're supposed to love, and they no longer thirst.
What's the end of this journey?
Well, let's find out here. So if we go and we'll skip the whole thing here, and we'll go all the way to Canto 33. Now, while I'm finding the page here, 33 is a significant number throughout the comedy. 33 was the number of years that Christ spent on earth. Every book has Purgatory has 33 cantos. Paradise has 33 cantos. Purgatory or Inferno has the canto where Dante's lost, and then it has 33 cantos after that. Each Dante's rhyme scheme consists of 3 interlocking lines that just interlock and go on interlocking throughout the whole poem. And each line has 11 syllables, and together the 3 lines have 33 syllables. So that's a poem scheme, a rhyme scheme that Dante invented, because this Christ is supposed to be throughout every page and every line of this book. So if we go to, now we're in Paradise 33, Dante has now had his, the deepest desire of his heart has been fulfilled. He has had the vision of God. And he says, here my exalted vision lost its power, but now my will and my desire, like wheels revolving with an even motion, were turning with the love that moves the sun and all the other stars. So Dante's final step, and that's how the poem ends. He is absorbed into this. His love is completely in line with God, and he is moved by the same love that moves all of creation and organizes everything.
In listening to you talk and take us through this journey, this contemplative journey through Dante's Divine Comedy, the thing that I've learned, again, my limited view of this, especially the Inferno, is that it just seems extremely harsh. And it doesn't seem, it just is. It's extremely harsh. And it didn't jive with a conception of God that I held. And it's almost like the entirety of the Divine Comedy itself is a repudiation of the idea that our conceptions and our ideas of what is just and good need to be laid aside. And justice itself is a relational concept that really puts us in alignment with God's will, rather than trying to impose our own judgments or will upon various situations. And as much as the Inferno illustrations were just really on a level of disgust that I don't want to go very often, nevertheless, it helped to illustrate the point more so than taking each episode and trying to analyze it. The grander meta-narrative of the whole thing is to illustrate the point that I need to put myself in alignment with God's will.
Yeah, that's a beautiful summation of it. And Purgatory is the book that I read over and over and over again. Inferno is a difficult book, but as you say, I mean, it's necessary to see, what builds upon it. And yeah, I think that Dante, more than any other book outside of Scripture, helps us get a view of how we can align ourselves with God and how we can love God and love Him in the right way.
What a treat to be able to have such an overview in such a short period of time. Thank you so much for being with us, Travis, and for sharing that with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we really appreciate your expertise, and I just want to thank you for being on the show once again. We look forward to the next episode, whatever that is in the future, where we can draw upon it again. So really appreciate you being here, Travis.
My pleasure.
May God's light wash over and fill us and draw us to Him. His love, the love that moves the sun and the other stars, move us to repentance and closer to Him, I pray. For Latter-day Contemplation, I'm Christopher Hurtado.
And I'm Riley Risto.
Thanks for being with us. Have a great week.